Okay, I'll leave it to you
Okay.
to decide
I think I'm
when
gonna
you want
start
to.
it now, guys. So,
Okay,
okay, here we go.
sounds good.
Three, two. All right. Three, two, one.
Welcome to the Politics of Information webinar series organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice at UWinnipeg, featuring speakers who research data, surveillance, power in the digital age. The Center for Access to Information and Justice focuses on public interest research and the use of access to information in social science. The UWinnipeg is located on Treaty 1 territory in the national homeland of the Red River Métis in Winnipeck, Manitowoc. We acknowledge these are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anis Ininu, Ininewak, Nahotawak, Oceti, Sakoan, Dakota Oyate, and Michif Métis peoples. UWinnipeg has to do a better job of confronting colonialism, and UWinnipeg has to do a better job of supporting Indigenous resurgence. I want to thank the UWinnipeg event team and media team for working on this webinar series. Here's the format for today. We have 80, 90 minutes with our speaker. We have time for questions from folks in the audience. You can just pop them into the chat tab and I will field those and I will moderate. And here is a little overview about the work and the contributions of today's speaker. Cecil Rosner has been a professional journalist in Canada for more than 4 decades. He was with CBC for 31 years, and his last position there was as executive producer of The Fifth Estate. He has taught the principles of investigative journalism across Canada and abroad for the last 25 years, and he's taught a course in investigative journalism here at UWinnipeg since 2005. He is the author of Behind the Headlines, A History of Investigative Journalism in Canada, Oxford University Press. He's also co-author of When Justice Fails, the David Milgaard story. Cecil's work has been recognized with Michener and Gemini Awards for his journalism and medals from the New York and Columbus Film Festivals, among many others. In 2019, in fact, he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Radio, Television, and Digital News Association of Canada. And he's also a major player at the fairly new Investigative Journalism Foundation, which I think we'll hear more about today. Thank you, Cecil, for being here. The floor is yours for your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Kevin. I appreciate the intro and the opportunity to do this. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. I hope everyone can see that. And yeah, this is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about public records and accessing information. So the first thing I want to say is that I think there's a very similar task for journalists or historians and many other academics and researchers. And that is, how do we find out about things? How do we find out about an event, about a story, or about anything really? How do we actually find out information? I know it seems like a very basic kind of question to ask, but I think it's an important one. And this is the way I try to think about it kind of conceptually. Journalists are looking for footprints. Historians are looking for footprints. We're looking for vestiges of things in the past. A historian might be looking for something that happened 3,000 years ago. Journalists might be looking for something that happened a week or a month ago or earlier that day. But it's all a vestige, and actually that word vestige comes from the Latin vestigium, which means footprint, and from that you get to investigative. to look into. Investigare, the Latin for to look into. That's what investigative journalism is all about. But I think that's what a lot of academic disciplines are about too. How to find stuff and how to look for those footprints. Um, and I like to think about this in a really simple way, that there's three basic methods for how we find out about anything. So I'm talking about journalistic historians and other researchers. And the first method is people, which may seem obvious, but it's worth stating out loud. Journalists interview people. Historians may interview people. They check testimonies. They look for records of what people have said. That is a major source of how we find stuff out. Another way to find things out is by just observing, personal observation, observing things with your own eyes, looking for those footprints, looking for some vestige that might exist. Journalists can do this for many of their stories. Historians do this. Scientific researchers do this. And the third kind of basic method are documents or records. And that encompasses a huge variety of things, public records, media, library research, web, databases, anything anything along those lines, I think falls into this bucket of documents and records. And I want to zero in on public records. Why? Because, well, they're public, or they should be public. Therefore, they should be accessible to us. Um, and that's why we have to conclude, I think, that it's the government that's the biggest repository of these kinds of records. And as I said, theoretically, they should be available for all of us to see. And it's certainly important for all of us to know about what these records are, how they can be useful to us as journalists or as researchers of different types, um, where to go, where to go to find these records, and how to really get access to them. So I actually want to Yeah, before I get into the nitty-gritty of that, I want to make this point, which I'm going to come back to. And that's a very fundamental problem in this whole area, which is that the government is in a conflict of interest on this front. What do I mean by that? Well, it decides what information is public. It decides how much access to information to provide. I'm not just talking about the Access to Information Act, although I am talking about that. I'm talking about all kinds of information that it routinely collects. It becomes the gatekeeper for how much of that to show us and how much of that to keep from us. And I think we can all acknowledge that it's pretty rare for government of any stripe to provide information that would embarrass the government or would somehow be injurious to the government's interests. And that's what I mean when I say there's a conflict of interest here. They're the people who collect all these public records, who make them accessible, supposedly, and yet they're also the ones who decide when they should suppress them. So let me take a few minutes because I'm old enough to remember the pre-internet era. In fact, I worked as a journalist in the pre-internet era. So I want to harken back to that era. Some of you may remember it. Some of you may not have been born in those days, but I want to show you how I investigated a person or a company in that era. Here's what I typically did. Here are some of the things I typically did when we're thinking about or talking about the concept of public records. I'd go to the land titles office. I used to work years ago at the Winnipeg Free Press. Their old building was over on Carleton Street downtown. So I'd put on my coat and head over to the land titles building where I could check uh, land ownership. I could find out who owned any piece of land and what their mortgages were and what any liens on it were, how much they paid for the land, and all the associated information you can find out when you check that public record, which is a land title. I went over to City Hall. There you can check all kinds of things. You can look at planning maps. You can look at property assessment records. You can find out how much people are paying uh, in taxes to the municipality for their properties. I then went over to the law courts building. That's where you could check records of statements of claim. Who is suing who? What are the criminal matters that are taking place? Who's filing for bankruptcy? What are the probate records that might be accessible, that might be interesting for a story that I might want to do? I could also go over in Winnipeg, it's the Woodsworth building. That's where I could check things like company records. I could look up records of companies in the companies branch. I could check with the Office of Personal Property Registry to find out who had a loan, who had a car loan, and who was using their car as collateral for a loan, or a boat, or furniture, or any other object, or machinery in their factory for that matter. And look, I was in Winnipeg, obviously. That's where I was a reporter. But if you're tuning in from anywhere else in Canada, there, of course, are these equivalent offices everywhere. Every province has an Office of Personal Property Registry, for example. They're filled with public records that you're entitled to check. Yeah, and then finally, I used this thing back in the day where I would call. I would call Ottawa, for instance. I would find out, hey, does such and such a person own such and such an aircraft? I would check the aircraft registry. I would check the vessel registry. Um, that's how I did my work. Public records were around. That's how I set about accessing them in those days. Okay. Um, then in 1983, along came the Federal Access to Information Act. So you might wonder what happened before 1983. Well, before 1983, you just asked. If you were interested in information from a federal government department, you just asked that department, hey, can I have this information? Can you please release this information to me? The Manitoba FIPA Act, Freedom of Information Act, came about in 1988. And every province and territory since 83 has also adopted their own Freedom of Information Act. Um, Oddly enough, simply asking sometimes produced better access to documents than you could achieve post 1983. So one example is coroner's reports, for example. Um, Before 1983, I would routinely get access to these, actually. Um, and post 1983, suddenly it became a very difficult document to get hold of. For a while after 1983, I was quite cynical about the act because it seemed in some cases to cut off access to things that I had routinely been able to access before. I've changed my view a little bit on that, but we'll get into that in a sec.
Cecil,
Then,
sorry to interrupt. Can you just try to pop the slides back up? I think they dropped uh, a little bit ago. Just try to share the screen again and see if we can get that going.
what can you see right now?
Just you.
Okay, that's not good.
It's okay.
Hmm.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, how much did you miss?
Just a couple of slides. I think it's okay just to pick it up right here.
All right,
Thank you.
sorry about that.
No, it's all good.
This is what I was just saying. Like, this is an example of a coroner's report that I would get routine access to before, prior to the introduction of the Access to Information Act. And there's other examples. But then, of course, the online era arrived, and then searchable databases became available. And when I do training, when I talk to reporters, I always stress that they need to know where searchable databases live, because this can provide an important source of knowledge to them about where to access public records. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly to show you what they are. Instead of having to visit a land titles office, you can now go online and check land titles. This is the Manitoba example, where you can find out who owns what property and what liens there are on them, what mortgages there are on them, and so on and so forth. Here's, for instance, the property is, instead of having to visit City Hall, you can access this online. You can punch in the name of any address in Winnipeg here, as an example, and find out how much the property is assessed at. Um, so here's an example of that. There's the University of Winnipeg's land assessment. And there's the assessment of all the properties that surround the University of Winnipeg. And this is all a public record. And you can do this for absolutely any property in Winnipeg. And I'm not sure how this system is set up. There's online access in many, many cities across Canada for this kind of thing. Here's rural Manitoba property assessment that you can access online. And as a matter of fact, in some of the searches you can do with this particular database, you'll see the purchase price of properties that are bought and sold um, in rural Manitoba. Here's Manitoba's court system that I can access online. I can put in a surname or a company name. I can find out whether they're involved in, you see where it says all divisions, um, King's Bench Family, King's Bench Civil, King's Bench Criminal, King's Bench Small Claims, Bankruptcy, Probate, and so forth. CA is Court of Appeal. This is all available to me online. It gives a snippet of information. Um, uh, and then I can then take the court file number and then order up that court file for a fuller picture of what's going on. But I can do a first level search right online. Here, for instance, instead of calling up Ottawa, as I used to have to do, I can check. This is the Canadian Civil Aircraft Register. This is a database that is run by Transport Canada. And it can tell me who the owner of every aircraft in Canada is. I can put in an owner name and find that information out. I can put in the mark of the aircraft. I could search by the serial number. I could put in WestJet and find out how many aircraft are in WestJet's fleet, and so on and so forth. Very useful searchable database. Here's the same thing when it comes to vessels. This is the vessel registration query system from Transport Canada. Again, I can put in an owner name and find out what vessels they own. Or if I was walking by the harbor in Gimli, I could spot the name of a boat and put in the vessel name, and it would tell me who owned that boat. These are all public records, all publicly accessible online. Here's that personal property registry I was mentioning earlier, where I can do a search for anyone who is using a physical object as collateral on a loan, typically a car, but it could be anything. And that is a public record, and that is something you can check at the Manitoba Office of Personal Property Registry. I can check to see if my motor vehicle has been recalled for a safety reason by putting the make and model in this particular searchable database from the government. Here's where I can check to see if who the directors of a federal corporation are. This is a free database offered by Corporations Canada. Provincially, it's a little more complicated. Many provinces charge for a search of this nature, but federally, you can actually do this search. So the era of searchable databases online has definitely opened up a huge window into more easily accessible public records. Um, so yeah, and I stress this all the time. Then having the knowledge of where to find and access, and I've just shown you a tiny number of them, but having this kind of knowledge for journalists and for other researchers is really critical to being able to put your finger on information that you might need. You can't read any of this, but when I do training, I actually go through many of these searchable databases, whether it's procurement databases for cities or provinces, or proactive disclosure databases from governments, or health inspections. Every municipality inspects restaurants and nail salons and swimming pools. And those are generally public records. The Securities Commission has files on brokers and such. So there's city council minutes that are accessible. Of course, there's provincial and federal Hansard. There's compensation disclosure documents that tell you what the salaries of many public servants are, and so on and so forth. There's one of my favorite searchable databases on the bottom of the page. It's the unclaimed bank balances. If you leave money in a bank account for more than 10 years, and forget about it, the federal government will post your name and information about that bank account online. It becomes a public record. Okay, but here's the big but on this one. There are limitations. Governments and public bodies are often unwilling, or, maybe I'm being generous by saying somehow incapable of providing information they possess. And this is where my comment about conflict of interest comes back. So yes, everything I've shown you is a public record, is fairly easily accessible. But so much more could and should be done and isn't being done. It must lead you to wonder why that is not the case. And it often leads me to wonder that. Here's a quick example. I'm going to go back to this slide. Remember, this is where you can search for a federal corporation. You have to put in the corporate name, and then it'll tell you who the directors are. What if I'm interested in a director? What if I'm interested in an individual? And I want to know how many corporations that individual is connected to. That's a typical kind of research question that a researcher might have, that a journalist might have. The government has that information. The government could provide that information, but you can't get it through this database. So what has happened is a number of other people in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, have come in to fill that gap. So for instance, here's a website, very valuable website. It's called Open Corporates. This is run by a non-government agency as a public service, really. And what they have done is they have collated corporation records from many countries around the world, more than 140 jurisdictions. And you see, on this site, I can search 200, look at the huge number, 222 million companies in all jurisdictions. But not only that, if you look right underneath that search box, I can search by company name and I can search by officer name. So here's something government could be providing that it isn't currently providing. I can find out whether Galen Weston is on the board of directors of any other companies around the world, for an example. So outfits like this have come to fill certain gaps, and I think that's a very important thing to think about. It's important to, again, know about the existence of some of these websites and to maybe reflect on the fact that why isn't the government doing this? Why isn't it helping us to actually do the kind of research that a lot of journalists and other researchers need to do? I mean, here's another example. You've probably all heard of Carfax. When you're buying a used car, you want to buy a Carfax report. It's a private company. All they've done is essentially buy up a bunch of public record databases for the most part and package it and resell it to you. Um, so they're filling a niche, again, that government perhaps could just be providing. Um, and yeah, I've realized this a long time ago as a journalist that sometimes you just need to build your own database when governments or public entities aren't helping you out on that front. So I'm going to show you a few examples of that I've been involved in over the years. Okay, um, here's one. This was a project we did at CBC a few years ago. It was called Deadly Force, and what we set out to do is put together all the fatal encounters that had occurred between individuals and police forces all across Canada between the year 2000 and the year 2017. Why did we do that? Well, every time police kill somebody in an encounter, a press release might come out, and then there might be a day or two of coverage of it, and then often it's forgotten about. Maybe an inquest happens some years later. We wanted to put all these together because then you can start to discern some trends and start to figure out what the truth of some things is. So this was a pretty painstaking project. No police force really helped us out here. We had to put this all together by hand, by checking media reports, by checking inquest reports, by looking through multiple sources to put this together. We eventually found, you see, there's 461 people who had died in police encounters in over this period of time. And that allowed us, and we then built a profile of each of those people to the best of our abilities. And that allowed us to see some trends. One trend, the vast majority of people who die at the hands of police in encounters are people of color, are indigenous. If you look in different regions, there's huge overrepresentation of Black people in places like Toronto, huge overrepresentation of Indigenous people in places like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and huge overrepresentation of people who die who were suffering some mental health crisis. But only by putting this together were we able to discern those kinds of trends and go beyond just an anecdotal kind of representation of what was going on. Here's another example of another project we did on missing and murdered Indigenous women. Again, we wanted to put together a database of cases that had not been solved by police. If you ask police, can you give us a listing of cases you haven't solved? They don't do that. They don't publicize that. So again, this was another very involved example of doing this. We came up with a little over 300 of these cases. Again, we created a profile. If you go to this website, if you just Google CBC and missing and murdered Indigenous women, you'll see it. You can read a profile of each of these victims. And again, this was a way to figure out what are the trends. What really happens in these types of cases? Here's another quick example. We did a project involving doctors who had been disciplined by their law societies across Canada. And again, we collated information over about 15 years. And what did this allow us to do? Well, many things. Here's one example of what it allowed us to do. It allowed us to make a list of doctors who had been disciplined more than once for something serious, in many cases involving some sort of abuse of their own patients, but were still being allowed to practice. And here's a bunch of those individuals at the time that we published this. Again, another example of yes, this information is there, but is it really accessible to us in a way that we can study, in a way that we can draw some lessons and learn from things? So that brings me to talk a little bit about the Investigative Journalism Foundation, where I'm working now, and it's a relatively new. It's a nonprofit. It's a startup, and what we do is we create these types of databases that I've just talked about, and we're constantly updating them. I'm proud of some of the work we did at CBC, but the problem there was once we created those databases I showed you, they became static. We moved on to other projects and we're not constantly updating them. At the Investigative Journalism Foundation, we are constantly updating all the databases I'm about to show you. Um, and we also have a reporting team so that the reporting team looks into these databases and other things and tries to derive stories from them. So what are these databases? Well, um, we have 13 of them so far. Um, so this is a listing of them, and I'm just going to show you what some of them are and what they're about. So for instance, we have a listing of people who donate to politicians, political parties, and candidates. Well, these are all public records. And you could go to elections.ca or the Manitoba equivalent or any provincial equivalent and find some of this information. But what we have done is we've taken all the data from the federal government and all the data from all the provinces and territories and gone back to the year 1993 and allow you or anyone to do one keyword search and get results across that entire data set. So you can see there we have over 9 million records in that period of time. So if I put in the name of anybody, I would say, oh, well, they donated to this Liberal candidate federally in 1997 and this NDP candidate provincially in 2008, and so on and so forth. So essentially, we're taking a whole bunch of public records, but combining them in what we think is a useful fashion for researchers to look into. So here you can search either by the donor or by the recipient. And then you can filter it by political party, year, region, and so forth. Um, we do something similar with lobby registrations. You probably all know most the federal government, most provincial jurisdictions have lobbyist registries. If you're going to lobby politicians, you have to register. Not all lobbyists do that. A lot of illegal lobbying, of course, takes place, but a lot of registered lobbying takes place, and you can find out interesting information. And we mine this database routinely for stories. Often you can get a jump on what the news of tomorrow is going to be by seeing who's doing the lobbying today. So again, what we've done is we've taken all the lobbyist registrations at the federal level and in every provincial and territorial level and combined them into one single data set. So I could put in SNC Lavalin, for instance, and then I could see where is SNC Lavalin lobbying? Oh, they're lobbying in Manitoba, PEI, federally. Who I can see who is doing the lobbying. I can see who they are lobbying, and so on and so forth. And then we provide links. If you click through these, we provide links to the specific actual records in the relevant lobbyist registry. As I say, this produces stories for us very, very routinely. We've put together something we've called a revolving door um, database. What is that? Well, in some provinces, not all, but in some, if you register as a lobbyist, but you have previously worked for that same government that you intend to lobby, you have to disclose that. Again, that's just a detail on a lobby registry. So what we've done is we've scraped all of that information from each of those registrations and put them in this database so that it's easier to search. So you could search by the name of the lobbyist, you could search by the name of the organization, or you can search by the public office. I was We did a story a while ago that 60% of Loblaws registered lobbyists are former government insiders. This is a very typical lobbying revolving door thing that people move in and out of government positions to industry positions, and then when they're in industry positions or 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 working for government relations companies or lobbyist firms, then they typically go and lobby the same people they used to work with, same people that maybe even reported to them. Um, this is one of our newer databases. It's appointments. To be appointed, many of you probably know that to become a judge or an ambassador or an aide to or to be a member of the board of Manitoba Hydro, you have to be appointed by the provincial government. We can find that out by checking orders in council, provincial and federal orders in council. Again, we have scraped the orders in council databases provincially, federally, and put them all together. You can search by position. You can see who all the judges are, who all the ambassadors are. You can compare things across jurisdictions. Instead of having to go check orders in council for this, we've put this database together so researchers can look at it quickly. Um, Here's a database that came to us in a sense. There's a fellow by the name of Ed Sadowski. He launched a 10-year battle. That's how long this lasted with the federal government to get his hands on records relating to residential schools. So when the compensation process began for residential schools, it was decided that the federal government needed to create what they called a narrative description of what went on in each of Canada's about 130, 140 residential schools. Well, this was supposed to be able to help claimants claim compensation. Because if you went to a residential school in 1950, how are you supposed to remember who was the principal, who were the teachers, etc.? Who were the abusers who later got convicted of things? So it was supposed to be of assistance um, to the claimants. Well, Ed Sadowski, who worked for the Shingwauk Residential uh, School Center doing research in Sault Ste. Marie, he wanted to see all of these narratives. Well, the federal government said no. He filed access to information requests, both to Ottawa, and he filed FIPA requests to the NCTR in Manitoba. And it took 10 years. Finally, the Information Commissioner ordered the release of these documents. He approached us and he said, would we be willing to post all these? And we said, yes. There are thousands and thousands of records that are posted here now that have never before been made public. That throw an interesting light on what went on. And these were not records even, many of you might know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a tough time getting records out of Ottawa. They themselves had to battle the federal government to get historical information about residential schools and couldn't get a lot of this information. Well, here's an example of some documents that are in existence that are now accessible through that route. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the Access to Information Act specifically. This, when it first came in '83, and here's section 2. Here's why the government brought it in. The purpose of this act is to enhance the accountability and transparency of federal institutions in order to promote an open and democratic society and to enable public debate on the conduct of those institutions. Great. That's very good, very noble objective. How has it worked in practice? Well, here are some problems that have existed since day one. And I know those of you who have tried using the act and have read about it, none of this is news, but let's list them anyway. Um, there's excessive redactions. Even if you get documents back from Ottawa, many of them have the best bits redacted. This is a rampant problem. There are arbitrary exemptions. You know, federal and provincial acts both talk about mandatory and discretionary exemptions. And study after study has shown that when it comes to discretionary exemptions, governments always err on the side of withholding rather than disclosing. There are lengthy delays. This is why most journalists have stopped using the act. It takes too long. It can take forever. It takes years in some cases to get a response. Um, and then there's a lack of consequences for violations. The federal government has to respond to a request within 30 days. What if they don't? You can complain and they violated the act, but nothing happens. There's no consequence. There's no real incentive for governments really to adhere to the provisions of the act. And you know, this might be obvious, but there is a lack of political will to strengthen these provisions. I love hearing politicians when they're in opposition talk about how we need to strengthen the provisions of access to information acts. And then when they get into office, suddenly they forget about that. It's off the agenda. Um, I'm talking about governments of every stripe. I've seen this happen. What's going on today on this front? Well, there is actually a movement by Ottawa, and I think it's being done in concert with provinces to weaken the legislation even further. As weak as it is, there are efforts being made. If you look at recent amendments that came in the Alberta legislation last year, if you look at what BC is proposing right now, if you look at what Ottawa is proposing right now, I think you have to conclude that there's efforts to make this piece of legislation in each jurisdiction even weaker. Um, but let me say this: I don't want anyone to have an illusion. Like, in spite of all these problems, I have used this act, and newsrooms I've worked in have used this act to find revelations about things. There have been many scoops. Undoubtedly, there have been. So it's not all black and white and doom and gloom. There are huge problems with it. There could be even huger problems with it. It is still, uh, journalists and other researchers can still find useful information here. But now I want to talk about one other serious flaw in this whole process. And that is, like, here's an example. Here's an access to information request I made a long time ago, 1985 to be exact. And they sent this to me. Fascinating document. It's all about the history of how the correctional services used to discriminate actively and try to root out all vestiges of LGBT presence in their ranks. An incredibly fascinating document. I believe I'm the only person in Canada who has this document right now. Why? Because it was released to me. It was not released to anybody else. And the federal government undoubtedly has destroyed this document by now. I kept it, but every department has retention policies. And so even material that is released to individual requesters isn't released to everybody. And then it tends to get destroyed. So why should that be? Well, that's what we asked ourselves, and then that's why we created this database, which I think is maybe the most interesting one of them all when it comes to this conversation. It's called Open by Default. What is it? We've tried to put our hands on as many already released access to information documents as we can, and then we collate them all and we provide them in full text. And then we've OCR'd them all. We've subjected all the documents to optical character recognition so that you can do a keyword search. And if you search Correctional Services Canada and homosexuals in their language, you will find that document. Um, right now, as you can see, we have about 7.5 million pages of already released documents. And I think this is a real treasure trove of information for journalists and for researchers of any kind. Um, and and really, again, this is something the federal government itself could do, should do, but isn't doing. So we're doing it. And this is a free to for anyone to search. Um, we actually have here's how we do it. Um, here's how we update it on an ongoing basis. We have a bot. There's a site out there called Completed Access to Information Requests that the federal government puts out. And what it says is so and so asked for, and here's the question, and we released X number of pages. That's all it says. Okay. Um, and if you want that document, well, you have to do what's called a piggyback request. It may take a number of days or weeks or months for you to get that information. And you don't know when you get that information whether it'll be of any real value to you or not. So that's why we've done what we've done. Right now, when you do a search, you see the document immediately. Um, so um, let, I'm not going to read or point you to anything on this page other than to say every 5 years, the federal government reviews the Access to Information Act. It's doing a review right now, and it put out a discussion paper. Let me show you three things that it said in that discussion paper. It wants to effectively remove transitory records from the scope of the act. By transitory records, I believe it's talking about things like emails and text messages, the very things that we all use nowadays, because those are modern means of communicating, that political aides and cabinet ministers and companies and everybody else uses. The government doesn't want to show those to us anymore. It wants to remove those from the scope of the act, which which would mean it would cover up a lot of the business of government and lobbying and everything else. Here's number two. Preventing a small number of requesters from overloading the ATI system would help institutions to provide fair and equitable. They're upset that some people are heavy users of the ATI system. Okay. I'm happy there are some people who are heavy users of the access to information system. It means that they're dedicated to ferreting out information. Government is not happy about them. And it goes further. It says bad actors use digital tools to flood the ATI system with requests. Such situations can consume a disproportionate amount of institutional resources and potentially delay responses to other requesters. So under the guise of, oh, we want to really help out most people, they want to root out these bad actors. They want to declare such people vexatious requesters. Is the Investigative Journalism Foundation a bad actor for trying to put our hands on every released document so that we can make it publicly accessible to all Canadians? I don't know. Maybe. Um, but I just wanted to show you what the federal government is saying right now about some of the changes it wants to introduce into the access to information regime. Um, so yeah, final point, and then I'll wrap it up, is that don't rely on government to hold itself to account. That'll never work. I'm talking to journalists. I'm talking to any kind of academic. It's not going to happen. Um, we have to fight to make sure that as much information as possible gets into the public sphere. So, you know, even a lot of mainstream journalists who are shy about being advocates for anything, I think need to be advocates for putting as much information about the operations of our governments into the public sphere as possible. Otherwise, um, if we don't pay attention to this, the trend is going to go in the opposite direction. And all the kinds of access I've shown you already, a lot of it may start to disappear. and that wouldn't really not to be to our benefit at all. So Kevin, I think I will end things right there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cecil. Thanks for all the work you've done in the investigative journalism sphere for so long. And thank you for continuing to push ahead with the foundation and showing us these amazing tools. It's just absolutely incredible. So there are some questions already from folks in the chat, and I'm just going to go into the chat and I'm going to start to check these out. One quick question to get us started. Can individuals donate to help the Investigative Journalism Foundation with piggyback requesting? Is there any kind of uh, dynamic you're looking for with members of the public there to help push this further?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're eager to hear from people all the time, and try to educate people about how best to. There is all kinds of tips for people who want to file their own access requests. There's a whole bunch of useful things that are useful to know to try to ensure a better result, and we're eager to help people do that all the time. Um, so yeah, and the federal government has its completed access to information site in which you can do a piggyback request. But it's such a laborious process. So any support we can have to kind of build up our capacity to do it for you, I think would be good for everyone involved. But I really encourage people to file access requests. Anytime you see something and you think maybe there's a document underlying that news story that would provide more information about something, um, would I'd encourage everyone to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, the federal websites for access, they tout, the digital means more access, but it's really difficult even for a heavy user to sometimes navigate what is going on with that website for sure. Next question here from Joel. What exists in law or policy regarding public access to lists and content of all FOI requests made, requests denied, and requests redacted?
Yeah, good question. I mean, federally and provincially, there's always annual report that comes out with some stats about here's the total number of requests that have come. Um, Here's how many have been fulfilled. Here's how many have been denied, and so on and so forth. So we hear about that. Um, so those types of lists are provided. Um, so it's not really, I don't think there's anything that exists in law, but by policy, it's federally and provincially and in the territories, those types of statistical analyses are generally provided.
Yeah. Here's another question from the audience. This one came in when you were talking about the boat registry uh, or the vessel registry. Can you say a little bit more about what constitutes a public record? How is it defined? Because some of them seem to have personal identifiers in them and some of them do not.
It's true. And it's not always clear which is a public record and which isn't. Um, I mean, yeah, I mentioned that all I need to know is the name of a vessel, and I can find out who the owner is. Here's an interesting contrast. If I'm driving and I see someone's driver's license plate, can I find out who the driver or the owner of that car is? And the answer is a no. So the concept of what is a public record kind of keeps shifting a little bit. Privacy concerns come to play. Those of you who are old enough might remember that when we had elections, they would actually nail the list of electors, like the people who are eligible to vote, to like telephone poles or trees in the neighborhood. That's not done anymore for privacy reasons. So sometimes things that are in the public sphere get removed from the public sphere for privacy reasons. Here's another example. Um, it used to be until fairly recently that I could go to the Manitoba courts and look at anyone's divorce file in family court filings. That record was made accessible to anyone who wished to look. And that actually provided a very valuable resource for journalists. I can give you specific examples. That's been taken out of the public sphere. Now the courts only allow direct parties directly involved in that matter access to those things. So you might say, oh, that makes sense. Why should anyone else have the right to go snooping in anyone else's divorce files? But there's sometimes competing interests. Courts are meant to be, there's open court principles. And for public interest purposes, it's sometimes very useful to see what people are saying in affidavits in all kinds of matters, in order to determine whether it's consistent with what is being said publicly. So again, this is where responsible journalism comes in. When those records were open, we didn't go around publishing everyone's divorce information, but we did look at it when we detected a public interest in determining whether there was something in there that was important to bring to the public's attention.
And kind of a follow-up question on that. Does privacy law restrict public interest investigations? And who is examining all these cases so that the spirit of freedom of information is upheld?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Look, in most provinces and federally, you have an information and a privacy commissioner. These are watchdogs for for how these acts work. So, for instance, if I file a access to information request and I'm denied access, I have an avenue to appeal that to. In Manitoba, it's the ombudsman. Federally, it would be the information commissioner. And there's privacy commissioners also that can make rulings about what maybe the federal government has redacted a name and they're citing a privacy provision in the act. I had one of these recently. I was asking for information about a suspected Nazi war criminal in Canada in the 1980s, actually. And this is an individual who died more than 40 years ago. Well, in my access to information request, they cited privacy provisions um, as to why they couldn't release information. And I'm in the middle of trying to challenge this, but there are no privacy rights connected to people that have been dead for 40 years. So you're right. Some of these things have to be adjudicated. But again, it comes back to one of the first statements I made in that the government's in a conflict. The government is in a conflict of interest. They make all the rules and then they make all the determinations about how much or they're going to release and how much they're going to redact. There are some mechanisms where you can challenge it through ombudsman, information commissioners, and ultimately you can even take the government to court. And that has happened on a number of occasions. And some people have succeeded. The Ed Sadowski, the fellow I told you about, who fought the government for a decade, he went all the way. He challenged. They said, oh, no, we can't release this for privacy, for this reason, for that reason. And ultimately, he prevailed. So, yeah, these things have to be adjudicated sometimes.
I'm going to jump in with a few questions here. You showed us these amazing databases that you're populating at the foundation, and you started the presentation with the maybe the source of that, which is the fact that databases at legacy media, they become static. They just stop getting populated. Can you say a little bit about some of the forces or the tendencies there? Like why is it that legacy media drop the ball on these really important tools?
You know, I think one of the reasons is journalists tend to do a story and then move on. What's the next story? Well, we've done that. Oh, we actually, on that deadly force database that I showed you, the interactions with police, we updated it once. 2 years later, we then updated it and did a further series of stories. But the thinking generally is, well, we've done it. We've done the story. We've made our point. We don't need to continue updating this thing. And I think that's really the problem. It becomes expensive. We have 3 people at the foundation working full time to make sure these databases are constantly updated, um, and building new ones and managing our website and so forth. It's an investment. It costs money to do this. So I think all those factors play into why you see a lot of very static things in many media reports nowadays.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I'm going back to the chat. Thanks everybody for putting your questions in there. Next question is from Jeff. What can journalists do to help move the line or at least hold it when it comes to challenging the government on access to information? I read too many stories where it simply says the government would not release that information or the government was unable to provide that information. How do you, as a journalist, hold the line?
No, that's a really good question. Look, I talked a little bit about the pre-access era. I mean, one of my techniques was, you ask the government for some information, they refuse to provide it. You do a story about that. You hold them to account. Um, you embarrass them for, or you question why it is that this can't be released. Now they tend to hide behind the law. They say, well, we'd love to provide this to you, but there's this law that says we can't, right? And I think that has to be pointed out that if they're citing a discretionary exemption, it has to be pointed out that it's their discretion. They are deciding to in their discretion to go one way and not the other way. Um, yeah, yelling is sometimes a good thing to do too. But um, and look, I think the Winnipeg Free Press is doing lots of great investigative journalism these days. I think, and in order to force institutions to give you information, we have to be persistent. We have to be we have to go the distance on some of these things, challenge things to the Information Commission, and even go to court. You know, in the book I wrote up on the history of investigative journalism in Canada, I devoted a chapter to this and to a guy called Ken Rubin, who's sort of the dean of of practitioners of access to information, and he went to court many times and won many times. Here's the government making all the rules, but we have a judiciary that will overrule the government on occasion. So, I mean, we need to use as many levers as possible. But I think, in the end, the power of the press is we can point these things out and we can say they're refusing. They are refusing to release this information when they could. So those are some things I think we can do.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Next question from Jordan. Can you talk a little bit about how the foundation has gone about collaborating successfully with other news outlets? Collaboration is sometimes rare in today's media landscape. Everybody's competing for attention. So How has the foundation gone about these partnerships?
Well, I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. Maybe that's the best way to answer this question. We came across a story. I don't know if everyone knows what an LMIA is. It's a labor market assessment. It's what an employer needs to tell the government that we can't find a worker to fill a job, therefore we have to hire a temporary foreign worker. Okay. Um, so we came to know that these LMIA documents were being bought and sold on the black market, and a lot of fraud was happening on this front. In other words, immigration consultants and certain companies were fraudulently creating these labor market assessments and then charging immigrants tens of thousands of dollars to buy these things in order for them to get a job in Canada. That's what was going on. Okay. Well, we could have done that story on our own, but we thought this is such an important story and it lends itself to actually, like a video representation, even using hidden camera to try to catch some people in the act. So we approached the CBC. We said, look, here's what we have. Here's what we think is going on. And they agreed. And we did just that. We caught various people in the act of buying and selling these LMIAs. I mean, this is the kind of exploitation of temporary foreign workers and immigrant labor that was going on and continues to go on in Canada. And so we thought this would be a good way to get this message out to as many people as possible. So there's an example of how some of these collaborations come about. Journalists typically are very territorial. They don't want to share their stories with other journalists to get scooped. Our attitude is we want to get the message out to as many people as possible. So we've partnered with all kinds of different media organizations to do just that. And I think in the end, it benefits everyone to do that.
I'm going to jump in with a question. You mentioned these kind of alarming ATI and FOI amendments coming down the line, and they're weakening the law. But it seems like they're, you know, collaborating themselves. There's a concerted effort. Have you seen any information on consultants, the role of consultants in this? So the federal government or provincial governments, they're getting some information from KPMG or something like that. And so the source of it is actually these private consultancies.
Not specifically, but it's so interesting to look at the provisions of different provinces, and you can actually, if you do that, you can actually see how some ideas and language is being gets borrowed, and there's inspiration. Like different jurisdictions are inspiring each other. Like a few years, I'll give you an example. Um, about 5 years ago, I believe, the Manitoba government increased the time frame that in which you had to respond, in which the government department had to respond to initial requests from 30 to 45 days. Okay. Now a bunch of other jurisdictions are proposing that. Um, Alberta last year passed a provision that the head of a government entity can decide, well, this request is too broad or too vague, and they can simply refuse to answer it. Now BC is proposing that in its current legislative proposal. So all these jurisdictions are watching each other, and taking cues from each other. This whole idea of let's stop the vexatious requests seems to be gaining traction as well. So I'm not sure. I don't know of consultants, but I certainly suspect there's a lot of information sharing going on at that level.
Folks in the audience, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So if you do have one, Feel free to put it into the chat. Thanks, Cecil, for being so generous with your presentation and with your answering of the questions here. Um, I have one one other question. Um, I was going to ask a little bit about uh, big data. So there's like a almost a fetishization of this idea of big data these days, putting together data sets that I don't know have millions and millions of rows. It seems like the work of the foundation is just focused on kind of databases that are not, as big as possible, but it's about like concentration of depth of inquiry. Can you just say a little bit about how you think about databases and how you try to build them, as opposed to like just fetishizing big data?
Yeah, I mean, look, the biggest of big data is controlled by private corporations, whether it's Facebook or Meta or Amazon or but we have access, wherever we can get access to data. I'll give you an example. I'll give you a specific example. Um, we did a story, we partnered with the Narwhal last year on the following story. In British Columbia, they have an energy regulator. This is a government body that goes and inspects oil and gas fields and pipelines to see is something going wrong. Is there a spill, right? Um, well, we heard anecdotally that they were being very lax, that there might be a spill, but they weren't doing anything about it. We could have done a story based on some anecdotes. Instead, we partnered with the Narwhal, which which has an interest in environmental reporting. And through Freedom of Information in BC, we accessed 40,000 inspection records. Okay. And then, well, what do you do with 40,000 inspection records? That's a big data set. We spent a number of weeks analyzing it. And drew the conclusion, essentially proved the hypothesis that the inspector would say, there's a spill, this is dangerous to public safety, and then they would not cite the company or ask the company to do anything about it. But it's only by putting all that data together into a database and analyzing it that you can say that with some degree of scientific accuracy. Because there are far too many media stories that just gather together three or four anecdotes and say, this is a thing, this is a trend, or this is the truth. And so to me, that's the necessity and the power of data and data journalism is you're able to say things with the much higher level of certainty than you otherwise could. So yeah, I think every media organization has to have specialists who know how to analyze data, who know how to manipulate data. That's over and above building databases, but it's like to do good journalism, to do good research of any sort, you either need to know how to do it yourself or you need to have access to people who can help you do that kind of analysis.
We're going to go to the two last questions in the chat, but just before that, I want to remind people in the audience, check out Behind the Headlines, check out When Justice Fails, and also Manipulating the Message, because these are very valuable resources for investigating access to information and access to justice in Canada for sure. Second to last question, can you give some examples of information that, in your view, should not be subject to access to information?
Sure. I mean, look, I'm not saying put everything out there. Privacy is a legitimate concern. If something impinges on people's truly private affairs, that should not be subject to access to information. But that idea gets perverted. We have a situation in Ontario right now where Doug Ford has been ordered by a court to release the logs of his personal cell phone. And he's saying, "Hey, that's my personal cell phone. I'm having private conversations with my constituents." Well, he's also having discussing government business on his cell phone. And so that should be parsed out. He should have to provide the logs of any government business he discusses on his cell phone. We had the same thing happen with a Manitoba premier, Brian Pallister, a few years ago. He had a private cell phone that he was doing government business on, and that properly should come under the purview of the Freedom of Information Act. But if he's having a private conversation with some constituent about their health matter, absolutely that should not be subject to access to information. So totally, there are things that should be excluded, but the reality is the government is excluding far too many things and using that among many other excuses to do so.
Absolutely. Last question to Joel, and this is a big one. It's about the future. How has or will artificial intelligence change investigative journalism and change access to information?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The story I just told you about with the narwhal, we used artificial intelligence to do our analysis. So the way I look at it is this. It's improper for journalism to use AI, to use generative AI to produce stories or photos. In other words, to produce the text you read or to produce the photos you see. But it's entirely proper and I think necessary to use every tool available, including AI, to do research, to do the analysis. There are some tools out there. There's Pinpoint, there's Notebook LM, there's Anthropic's Claude, CoWork. These are tools whereby you can upload a large number of documents and then query the documents. So I would say the responsible way to use AI for journalistic or academic or any other kind of research is, like, I'll give you an example. If a budget comes, the Manitoba budget came out a little while ago. If you're a journalist, you could load up the last 10 years of Manitoba budgets, say, into an AI service, and then quickly try to verify, has this thing that the government has announced been announced before, right? As long as you are confident in the accuracy and the credibility of the sources that your AI is using, I think it's responsible to use it. So this is a constantly evolving thing. If you just go and, like, AI is trying to crowd out regular search these days. If you do a Google search now, the first thing you often get is Google's AI, and which often can be wrong. So the critical thing in using AI is to check the sourcing, make sure the sourcing is credible. But yeah, I think it will be a huge aid in the future to journalistic research.
Do you have any concerns about AI use on the access side, like the government using AI to vet our requests, engage in new kinds of overbroad redaction and severing of records?
Uh, totally. I mean, and that is my fear. Like, there have been stories about we're tracking that carefully. Every federal government that's using AI in an effort to cut jobs, perhaps, but because there's bias. Bias it gets inserted into decisions that are made that can unfairly treat different sectors of the population. So yeah, there's always have for any important decision, there must be human oversight. I mean, that should just be a general principle. There's got to be human oversight. Otherwise, you're going to get injustices being perpetrated on an even more mass scale. without that human oversight. So look, we're in the early days of AI. There's a lot. I'm not one of those people that either says, "Oh my God, don't use it ever," or "This is the be all and end all." Um, we have to use it like any other tool, and we have to use it responsibly.
Well, thanks, Cecil, for telling us about what you're working on. Totally inspiring dedication to investigative journalism. So much to teach journalists, but also academics and activists. And I'm just so happy that you were able to make some time for us today. And I hope everyone will check out the work of the foundation in the years ahead.
Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, take care, everybody. Stay safe. Thanks for being here, and talk to you again. Bye bye.